The snow clung to the ground like a thick, oppressive blanket, muffling the world in a haunting silence. Ingrid stumbled through the icy landscape, her breath a visible cloud in the frigid air. She had never known cold like this, not in her quiet, rural village where winters were long but not this cruel. The German soldiers marched ahead, indifferent to the suffering of the prisoners who were forced to follow in their wake. Her eyes were swollen from exhaustion, her feet raw from the relentless march, but there was no choice but to keep moving. The distant sound of boots crunching on the snow was the only sound that accompanied them, an eerie soundtrack to the nightmare that had become Ingrid's life. She had been captured months earlier, during a raid that had left her village in ruins. When the Nazis swept through the area, taking the men and women who would be of use to them, Ingrid had tried to escape into the nearby forest. But it was no use. Her fate had been sealed the moment they had found her, along with the others who were now her fellow captives. She had been thrown into a cattle car along with a dozen others, packed in like animals, with no thought given to their comfort or well-being. It was a journey that lasted days, and by the time they arrived at the camp, Ingrid felt as though she had already endured a lifetime of suffering. But the camp was not the end of her misery, it was only the beginning. As the long march continued, the soldiers seemed to take pleasure in pushing the prisoners to their breaking points. The bitter cold bit through her thin clothing, numbing her limbs and clouding her mind. Ingrid tried to focus on the one thought that kept her going: survival. She had seen what happened to those who faltered, who couldn't keep up with the march. They were left behind, abandoned to the elements or shot for their failure to comply. In the cold, gray silence of the snow-covered landscape, Ingrid could feel her strength beginning to slip away. She had been trained for this, had learned how to survive in the harshest conditions, but nothing in her previous life had prepared her for the endless cruelty of the soldiers who seemed to take delight in their power over the prisoners. Her body was not the only thing that was breaking. It was hard to hold on to hope when every step felt like a step closer to death. She had heard the whispers, stories of the labor camps, of the atrocities that awaited those who survived the march. They spoke of starvation, of forced labor in the mines, of the unyielding cruelty of the guards who held the power of life and death in their hands. Ingrid had braced herself for what was to come, but as the days passed, each one colder and more grueling than the last, she began to lose sight of why she was fighting so hard to stay alive. She was no longer certain that survival was worth the price she was paying. The weight of the snow, the cold that gnawed at her bones, and the fear that gripped her heart all began to blend together into a fog of despair. There were moments when the pain became so unbearable that Ingrid wanted to give up, to let herself fall into the snow and simply disappear. But even in her weakest moments, she could not bring herself to give in. There was something deep inside her that refused to break, something that kept her moving forward even when every muscle in her body screamed for rest. Perhaps it was the thought of her family back home, of the life she had left behind. Or perhaps it was simply the fear of what would happen if she stopped moving. The soldiers would leave her behind, and that was something Ingrid could not allow. As the days dragged on, Ingrid began to notice a change in her fellow prisoners. The once strong men, the ones who had seemed so certain and defiant, were beginning to show signs of weakness. They too had been broken by the relentless march, their spirits crushed beneath the weight of the cold and the constant fear of death. Ingrid could see it in their eyes, the same hollow emptiness that she felt inside herself. No one spoke of it, but they all knew. The end of the march was inevitable, and once they reached their destination, they would face the same fate. They had heard the stories too. The camp was nothing more than a death sentence wrapped in a semblance of order. Ingrid had always been taught that there was strength in unity, that the bonds between people could carry them through even the darkest times. But now, in the cold expanse of the frozen wilderness, it felt as though unity had been stripped away. The prisoners no longer looked at each other with solidarity or understanding. There was no camaraderie among them. They were all just individuals struggling to survive, and that survival was a solitary pursuit. Ingrid's world had shrunk to the rhythmic crunch of her boots in the snow, the rhythmic pulse of her heart, and the distant hope that, somehow, this would end. It was late one evening, when the darkness had descended like a suffocating blanket, that the soldiers ordered the prisoners to halt. The cold air seemed to freeze in place, and for a moment, it felt as though time itself had stopped. Ingrid stood there, barely able to feel her feet, her mind racing to understand what was happening. She had heard rumors of this moment, of the time when they would be told that they had reached their destination, that the camp was just ahead. But it didn't feel like an end. It felt like another beginning, one that would be just as brutal as the march itself. As the soldiers barked orders, Ingrid felt a flicker of panic rise in her chest. The prisoners were being pushed into a formation, lined up in rows as if they were cattle being prepared for slaughter. The tension in the air was palpable, the soldiers' impatience growing with every passing second. Ingrid could see the other prisoners, their faces pale and drawn, their eyes filled with the same fear that gripped her own heart. She could hear the whispers, the anxious murmurs that rippled through the line, and she realized, with a sickening jolt, that they all felt the same. They were all waiting for the cruelty to begin. But it didn't. Not yet, at least. Instead, the soldiers led them to a small cluster of huts, where they were herded inside, their bodies packed tightly together for warmth. Ingrid's heart was still racing, but the momentary reprieve allowed her a breath, a chance to regain some semblance of control. She was exhausted, her mind numb from the strain of the march, but there was a strange sense of relief in knowing that they had arrived at some kind of destination, even if it was only temporary. The camp was still a distant terror, a looming shadow in the back of her mind. Ingrid knew it would come, sooner or later. The fear was inescapable. But for now, the cold had lessened, and the fear of the unknown, of what awaited her in the coming days, had temporarily faded into the background. She closed her eyes and allowed herself to rest for just a moment, knowing that the real fight was far from over. It was coming, but she would face it with whatever strength she had left. For now, she would hold on to the fragments of hope that remained. The barracks were a stark contrast to the outside world, a place where the harsh winds and relentless cold of the Russian front seemed to be momentarily forgotten. Yet even within the walls, the atmosphere was thick with a different kind of cold, one born of hopelessness, fear, and a slow, suffocating despair. Ingrid had barely taken a step inside the cramped wooden building when she was shoved to the ground by a rough hand, the guard's boots crushing the floorboards as he barked at her to move faster. Her body ached from the long march, but there was no time to complain, no time to rest. She quickly scrambled to her feet and joined the throng of prisoners being herded into the dimly lit room. The stench of sweat, dirt, and unwashed bodies was overpowering, clinging to the air like a thick fog. The barracks was overcrowded, far more than it was ever meant to hold. There were no beds, only rows of filthy straw scattered across the floor, where the prisoners were expected to sleep, or at least rest, when they could. Ingrid found a small space in the far corner, next to a woman who looked to be near collapse. Her skin was ashen, her eyes sunken with hunger and fatigue. She didn't acknowledge Ingrid's presence, her hollow gaze fixed on the wall. The others around them were much the same, silent, broken, and barely holding on. Ingrid could feel their suffering, a collective pain that seemed to seep into her own bones. She wanted to speak to someone, to find some comfort in shared words, but the weight of the place made it difficult to think, let alone converse. She sat down on the straw, her back against the cold wall, and tried to keep her breathing steady. The chill from the floor seeped through her thin clothes, gnawing at her already fatigued body. She could feel her stomach growling, her insides aching from hunger, but there was nothing to eat here, nothing except the occasional scraps of food they were given, which were often little more than slop. She was too weak to care about the hunger anymore. Instead, her mind wandered to the cruelty of it all. How had things come to this? How had her once peaceful life been turned into a fight for survival? She closed her eyes, trying to block out the noises around her, the coughing, the sobbing, the shuffling of feet. Even the sound of the wind howling outside seemed to press in on her. She thought about her family, her mother's face, her younger brother's laughter. The memories felt distant, as though they belonged to someone else. Ingrid had been raised to survive, to endure hardships. But this was something different. This was something that tore at the soul itself. Hours passed in silence, the prisoners too tired and broken to do anything but wait. The only movement came from the guards, who entered occasionally to make sure the prisoners remained in line. They walked the length of the barracks, their boots heavy on the wooden floor, their eyes scanning the room like predators searching for their prey. Ingrid had seen enough to know that any sign of weakness, whether it was physical or emotional, would be punished, sometimes severely. The guards seemed to take pleasure in the power they held over the prisoners. They relished the fear, the desperation that clung to the air like smoke. But Ingrid had learned early on to keep her head down, to blend into the background, to become invisible. The hours dragged on, and the oppressive weight of the barracks seemed to grow heavier with each passing minute. Ingrid's eyes fluttered open as she felt a sharp, cold jolt of air pass through the room. The door had opened, and 2 guards had entered. One of them was shouting in a language Ingrid couldn't quite understand, but the tone was unmistakable, harsh, authoritative, and angry. She could feel her body tense as the guards made their way down the row of prisoners. They stopped occasionally, grabbing a person by the arm, yanking them to their feet, and shoving them toward the door. There was no explanation, no warning. Ingrid's heart raced, her breath quickening as she watched. She tried to stay still, to make herself as small as possible, but the guard's eyes swept over her, and for a moment, their gaze locked. He seemed to hesitate, his eyes narrowing as he took in her appearance, pale, thin, exhausted. Ingrid could feel the cold sweat forming on her forehead as she held his gaze, her chest tightening in fear. She had no idea why he singled her out, but in that moment, all she could think of was the stories she had heard. The whispers of prisoners taken for special treatment, those who never returned, who disappeared into the night without a trace. The guard finally turned away, moving on to someone else, and Ingrid exhaled in relief. But that relief was fleeting, like the warmth that escaped when a door is opened on a cold winter's night. She knew that fear would always be present here, hovering over every moment, waiting for the next time the guards would come to make an example of someone. The cruelty was not just physical, it was psychological, a constant torment that broke the mind even before the body was destroyed. The days that followed were no better. Ingrid's body had become used to the constant hunger, the bone-deep weariness, but the mental toll was another matter. The barracks were a place of quiet desperation. The only sounds that filled the air were the soft murmurs of the prisoners, the occasional cough, and the harsh voice of the guards as they passed by. The routine was monotonous. Work, eat, rest, repeat. They were forced to toil under the watchful eyes of the soldiers, their every movement scrutinized for any sign of defiance. At first, Ingrid had clung to the hope that something, anything, might change. She had hoped that the Allies would come, that some kind of miracle would save them. But each day, that hope seemed to fade just a little more, like the distant memory of sunlight on a cloudy day. She had seen the way the others had begun to accept their fate, the way they had surrendered to the idea that survival was no longer something to strive for, but something to endure until the end. It was a form of surrender that Ingrid couldn't quite bring herself to accept. There was still a small part of her that fought back against the despair, even when it felt like that fight was meaningless. One day, Ingrid was assigned to work in the camp's kitchen. It was not a glamorous job, nor one that promised any real comfort, but it was a small reprieve from the constant physical labor in the cold. The kitchen was a cramped, poorly lit room where prisoners were tasked with preparing food for the rest of the camp. The work was grueling and the conditions were hardly better than anywhere else in the camp, but it was a chance to see something outside the barracks, something that felt slightly more normal. But even this small comfort came with a price. Ingrid quickly learned that the kitchen was a place of harsh discipline, where the guards had no qualms about using force to enforce their authority. A single mistake, a single error in the preparation of the food, was enough to earn a punishment, and the punishments were swift and severe. But it was here that Ingrid began to observe something that she hadn't seen before, something that would change her perception of the camp. Among the prisoners who worked in the kitchen, there were a few British soldiers. They had been captured during a raid and were now stuck in the same cycle of suffering and despair. But unlike the others, the British soldiers carried themselves differently. They were not immune to the cruelty of the guards, but there was a quiet defiance in them. They never spoke of it, never made a show of it, but Ingrid could see it in the way they held their heads high, in the way they moved with purpose, even when they were on the brink of exhaustion. Ingrid had heard whispers about the British, how they had managed to retain a sense of dignity, even in the darkest of times. She had heard that they had an unshakable sense of honor, that even the most brutal conditions could not break them. At first, she had dismissed it as just another story, another piece of propaganda meant to instill hope in the hopeless. But seeing it for herself was something different. These men, though broken by the same suffering, still seemed to carry something with them, something Ingrid couldn't quite name. It was in their silence, in the way they spoke to each other in hushed tones, never letting the guards overhear. It was in their ability to hold onto their humanity in a place where humanity had been stripped away. Ingrid couldn't explain why, but she found herself drawn to them, watching them from the corner of her eye, fascinated by the quiet strength they exuded. In a place where every small act of kindness seemed like an impossibility, they were a reminder that some part of the human spirit could not be crushed. Ingrid still wasn't sure what that meant for her, or whether it had any bearing on her own survival. But in that moment, as she watched them work, side by side with the others, she felt something stir within her, a faint, flickering hope that perhaps the stories weren't just stories after all. Perhaps, in the midst of all this suffering, there was still something worth fighting for. The days in the camp passed with an unbearable monotony, each one blending into the next, indistinguishable from the last. The sun, when it appeared, seemed weak and distant, like a faint memory of a time when the world had not been consumed by the war. Ingrid had become numb to the routine: wake up, eat whatever scraps were left, work in the freezing cold for hours, then return to the barracks to sleep, if she could manage to sleep at all. The sounds of the camp were relentless: the clanging of metal, the crack of boots on the hard ground, the shouts of the guards, and the ceaseless murmurs of prisoners who spoke only in hushed tones, as though afraid that any noise louder than the softest whisper would provoke the wrath of the soldiers. The air was thick with fear, with desperation, with the weight of bodies and spirits breaking under the strain of cruelty and deprivation. Ingrid had grown accustomed to the grim reality of the camp, but there were moments, fleeting and almost imperceptible, when something would break through the numbness. A sound, a look, a glance, small, almost imperceptible acts of defiance or humanity that reminded her that not all was lost. These moments were rare, but they kept her going, if only for a while. There was one such moment that Ingrid would never forget, a moment that seemed to shimmer through the fog of despair and offered her a glimpse of something she hadn't thought possible: hope. It came one morning as the prisoners were gathered for roll call, standing in line in the bitter cold, their bodies shivering under the weight of the wind. The guards were there, their usual stern faces set in lines of authority, their eyes scanning the crowd for any sign of resistance or weakness. Ingrid stood as still as she could, her hands buried deep in the pockets of her threadbare coat, her body bent from the cold, her mind drifting between memories of home and the harsh reality of the present. She had long since stopped feeling the cold in the way she once had. It was more of a constant ache now, a dull throb that resonated in every part of her body, making it harder to stand, to move, to breathe. She was just about to lose herself again in that fog of exhaustion when she heard it. A soft, almost imperceptible cough came from the row of British prisoners standing a few feet away from her. At first, she thought it was nothing more than the sound of someone choking on the cold air, but then it came again, followed by a faint but unmistakable noise, a soft laugh. A prisoner in the row had actually laughed. The sound was so unexpected, so out of place, that for a moment, Ingrid was unsure if she had heard it at all. But there it was again, a low, quiet chuckle, so quiet that only a few could hear it, yet it was enough to catch Ingrid's attention. She looked over at the British prisoners, who were lined up just like the rest of them, their faces drawn and pale from exhaustion, their eyes as hollow as the others. But unlike the others, they didn't look broken. They looked, in some strange way, defiant. Ingrid could see it in the way they held their heads, the slight tension in their posture, as though they were waiting for something. As though they were waiting for the moment when everything would fall apart, and they would be ready to meet it head-on, with something more than just survival in mind. The man who had laughed was one of the younger British prisoners, his face still bearing the marks of youth despite the harshness of captivity. He was standing tall, his back straight, his eyes scanning the crowd in a way that seemed to dare the guards to do their worst. There was something in his gaze that struck Ingrid, something she had not seen in any of the other prisoners, courage. It wasn't the kind of bravery that came from strength or power. It was the kind of courage that came from a quiet, unwavering resolve, a decision that no matter what, he would not let the camp break him. It was as though he had already accepted the worst, had already faced the darkness, and had chosen to walk through it with his head held high. Ingrid's breath caught in her throat as she watched him. She couldn't explain why, but there was something magnetic about his presence. He wasn't the strongest man in the camp, nor the most defiant, but there was something about him that drew her in. It was his calmness, his quiet refusal to let the circumstances defeat him, that made her feel as though she, too, could hold on for just a little longer. She had been through so much, had seen so much suffering, but in that moment, the simple act of a young man laughing in the face of their shared torment made her believe, even if only for a fleeting instant, that there was still something worth fighting for. The laugh, though brief, spread through the row of British prisoners like a spark in dry grass. Slowly, other men began to straighten up, their shoulders broadening, their eyes lifting from the ground. There was no grand gesture, no dramatic show of rebellion, just a quiet, unspoken defiance, a collective decision to not allow the camp to take away everything they had left. It was in the way they stood, the way they breathed, the way they interacted with each other in the silence of the cold morning. Ingrid watched as they exchanged glances, their faces drawn but not defeated. She could see that they were different from the others, that they were holding on to something that the camp couldn't take away. The guards, of course, noticed the shift. One of them stepped forward, his eyes narrowing as he surveyed the prisoners. He barked an order, his voice sharp and threatening, demanding that the British men step forward for inspection. But the British prisoners, unflinching, followed his orders without hesitation, their movements precise and calm. Ingrid noticed that they didn't cower, didn't shrink under the guards' gaze. They didn't fight back either, not in the way one might expect. They simply complied, but in a way that seemed almost indifferent. They had already made their choice, and whatever happened next wouldn't change that. The guard's eyes flicked over them, searching for any sign of rebellion, any hint of resistance. He didn't find it. Instead, he simply sneered, his face twisted in disgust, and barked for them to move along. The moment had passed, but for Ingrid, it was a moment that would stay with her for a long time. It wasn't just the laugh or the defiance of the British prisoners. It was the quiet dignity with which they carried themselves, the refusal to let the camp strip away their humanity, even when everything else had been taken from them. Ingrid had seen cruelty and despair in this place, but she had never seen such quiet strength. In the days that followed, Ingrid found herself watching the British prisoners more closely. She didn't understand it at first, why they seemed so different from the others, why they held themselves with such quiet resolve. But as the weeks dragged on, and the crushing weight of the camp began to press down on her once again, she began to understand. It wasn't that they were immune to the suffering of the camp, far from it. They too were broken by the hunger, the cold, the endless labor. But there was something in the way they responded to it, something in the way they held on to whatever dignity they had left, that made them stand apart. They had accepted their fate, but they had not surrendered to it. Ingrid began to see the difference in herself too. She had spent so much time focusing on the pain, on the cold, on the hunger, that she had lost sight of the small things, the fleeting moments of defiance, the quiet acts of kindness, the sparks of humanity that still flickered in the darkest of places. The British soldiers had reminded her of something she had almost forgotten, that even in the most hellish of circumstances, there was still room for dignity, still room for hope, still room for small, quiet rebellions of the soul. It was in the British prisoners that Ingrid saw a kind of strength that transcended the physical. It was a strength of spirit, of mind, and of will. They were broken, yes, but they were not defeated. And that, more than anything, gave Ingrid something she hadn't realized she was missing. A reason to keep going, a reason to keep fighting, even when the end seemed inevitable. She wasn't alone in this. There were others who refused to be broken. And as long as she could find a way to hold on to that, perhaps she, too, could find the strength to survive. The days that followed were a blur of routine, the kind that made time feel like an endless cycle, spinning without end or purpose. Ingrid woke every morning to the sound of the harsh orders of the guards, the clanging of the iron gates being swung open, and the cold rush of air that cut through the barracks like a knife. Her body had grown so accustomed to the cold that it almost seemed a part of her now, an uninvited companion that would not leave, no matter how much she wished for warmth. The incessant hunger, the fatigue, the endless labor, everything seemed to blur into a dull ache that had settled deep into her bones. Yet, amidst it all, there were moments, small, fleeting moments, that broke through the monotony like rays of light piercing through a stormy sky. It was one such moment, at the end of a grueling workday, that Ingrid found herself summoned. She had just finished a long stretch of work in the camp's crude factory, where the prisoners were forced to make munitions for the Nazi war effort, when one of the guards came into the barracks and barked her name. She was too tired to react at first, her mind heavy with exhaustion, but when she heard her name again, sharp and commanding, something inside her jolted. There was no time to question or protest. She stood up, her legs trembling with the effort, and followed the guard down the narrow path toward the building that housed the officers' quarters. The air seemed colder here, the scent of decay more potent, and the atmosphere grew heavier with each step. Ingrid's mind raced with questions, but she had learned long ago that asking questions in the camp was an invitation for trouble. She could only focus on keeping her head down, moving quickly, and trying to suppress the knot of fear that was growing tighter in her chest. Her thoughts turned to the worst possible scenarios. Perhaps she had been selected for punishment, or worse, for one of the crueler tasks that had been assigned to other prisoners in the past. She had heard rumors of the camp's darkest corners, the places where prisoners would disappear, never to be seen again. But she had no choice but to follow, her heart beating faster with every step. They reached the building, and Ingrid was pushed inside with little ceremony. She glanced around quickly, her eyes adjusting to the dim light. The room was small, almost cramped, and the air was thick with a strange tension. She could hear muffled voices in the next room, but it was impossible to make out the words. The guard gestured for her to stand in the center of the room, then left without a word. For a moment, Ingrid was alone, her breath shallow as she waited for whatever would come next. Time seemed to stretch out, each second feeling like an eternity. It was a stark contrast to the oppressive silence of the barracks, and for the first time in a long while, Ingrid felt the weight of her isolation more acutely than ever. Then, the door opened again, and this time, it wasn't a guard who entered. It was one of the British prisoners. Ingrid had seen him before, though she had never spoken to him. He was one of the younger men, his face familiar but distant, as if he had kept to himself most of the time. His eyes, though tired and sunken, held a kind of clarity that Ingrid hadn't seen in many of the other prisoners. There was something about him that made him stand apart from the others, something she couldn't quite put her finger on, but something that drew her in nonetheless. He didn't look at her at first, but Ingrid could feel his gaze on her as he entered the room, his presence immediately filling the space. He didn't speak, nor did he need to. It was the way he moved, the quiet strength in his posture, that spoke louder than words ever could. The officer who had been in the room with them stood aside, a silent observer to the encounter. Ingrid wasn't sure what to make of it, but she couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted. The British prisoner stepped toward her, his movements slow but deliberate. For a moment, Ingrid's heart raced, uncertainty gripping her. What was this about? Was he here to take her somewhere? To punish her? But then, to her surprise, he reached into his coat and pulled out a small bundle. He walked closer, his eyes still not meeting hers, but there was no malice in them, only something that resembled kindness. He handed her the bundle, and it took a moment for Ingrid to understand what it was. It was food, bread, a small piece of cheese, and a cup of warm tea, something she hadn't tasted in weeks. For a moment, she was stunned. She had been prepared for cruelty, for more suffering, but this act of kindness, caught her completely off guard. She had heard the whispers of British soldiers treating their fellow prisoners with an unexpected tenderness, but to witness it in person, to feel it in the pit of her stomach, was something entirely different. She hadn't realized just how much she needed something like this, something that wasn't fueled by violence or fear. Ingrid's hands shook as she accepted the food, her mind struggling to comprehend the gesture. She couldn't remember the last time she had eaten anything that wasn't scraps or tasteless gruel. The warmth of the tea seemed to reach deep into her bones, and for the first time in a long while, she felt something other than cold and hunger. The British soldier stood there, watching her quietly, waiting. He didn't say anything, there were no words necessary. It was as though he had done this countless times before, and in some way, Ingrid realized that this small act of kindness, this simple offering, had become a part of him. It was an unspoken defiance in a world where everything had been stripped away. It was a refusal to let the brutality of the camp erase all sense of humanity. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Ingrid looked up at the soldier, her mind still racing, but somehow calmer now, as if the storm inside her had momentarily subsided. The officer in the corner of the room shifted uncomfortably, but there was nothing he could do. He wasn't in charge here. The British soldier was. Ingrid realized in that fleeting moment that this man had taken a risk. He had defied the rules of the camp, the unspoken laws of survival that dictated every interaction, every movement. He had given her something, a gift, a reminder of what it meant to be human, even in a place that had forgotten such things. Finally, the soldier spoke, his voice low but steady. "Eat," he said simply, the command almost like a soft suggestion. "It won't be enough, but it's something." Ingrid nodded, too overwhelmed to say anything. She brought the food to her lips, savoring each bite slowly, almost as if she feared that the moment would slip away if she didn't hold on to it. The bread was tough, the cheese was bland, but it was food, real food. The warmth of the tea soothed her throat, and for the first time in what felt like forever, she could almost imagine that things could be different. That there could be moments of kindness, of humanity, even in a place like this. The soldier didn't stay long after that. He left without a word, the door closing behind him with a soft thud. Ingrid was left standing there, holding the cup of tea in her hands, her heart a strange mixture of gratitude and disbelief. The officer, still standing silently in the corner, nodded curtly and gestured for her to return to the barracks. But Ingrid was no longer the same person who had walked into this room a short time ago. Something inside her had shifted, something small and fragile but significant. It wasn't just the food. It was the kindness, the recognition that there was still something left, something that the war and the brutality of the camp hadn't been able to erase. And for the first time since her capture, Ingrid allowed herself to believe that there might be a way out of the darkness. It wasn't clear and it wasn't certain, but for now, it was enough. She left the room, feeling the warmth of the tea still lingering inside her, a small but powerful reminder that even in the coldest, most desolate places, kindness could still exist. The days had grown colder, the air more oppressive, as winter stretched endlessly over the camp like an unrelenting fog. The first signs of spring seemed impossibly distant, a faint hope that flickered in the minds of the prisoners but remained just beyond their reach. Ingrid had become accustomed to the rhythm of suffering, the morning roll calls, the hours of back-breaking labor, the hunger that gnawed at her insides with every passing day. It was the same routine every day, and yet, in the midst of the unyielding cold and the endless work, something had begun to shift. Ingrid couldn't quite name it, but she felt it in the pit of her stomach, an undeniable pull towards something that felt different. The quiet defiance she had seen in the British prisoners, the small moments of humanity, had taken root within her, and though she couldn't yet see where it would lead, she found herself holding on to that flicker of hope, clinging to it as if it were a lifeline in the darkness. Her thoughts often returned to the young British soldier, the one who had given her food that day in the officers' quarters. His kindness had been an anomaly, something Ingrid had never expected, and yet it had planted a seed within her, a seed of possibility. She had seen that there was still room for compassion, even in a place where cruelty and fear reigned. It had been a simple act, a quiet exchange, but it had left an indelible mark on her, and she could not forget it.